I only wanted to find my uncle, but the trail remembered me before I ever stepped foot on it or listening to ASMR 404 Found. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. They said Dead Elk Crossing was cursed before the town even had a name, before the first trails were carved into the earth, before the trees had even finished whispering about the blood they'd already soaked into their roots, and I never believed it. Not really, not when my uncle told me those stories, not when I found his old journal packed with scraps and warnings, not even when the search parties gave up and no one ever spoke his name. Again, they just said hikers disappear out there, and no one should go near that place after sundown, but they didn't know me, and they didn't know what I owed him. And I thought, if I followed the trail right, if I stuck to the map, if I ignored the weird feeling in my chest, I could find whatever he found or die trying. The entrance was already strange when I reached it, like the forest wanted to keep me out. The wooden sign had cracked in half, but the carving was still deep enough to read. Dead Elk Crossing, etched like claw marks, and the paint faded into something redder than rust and darker than blood. And when I stepped past it, it felt like stepping into water, like I was leaving something behind and walking into a place where sound got swallowed and light didn't move the way it should. The trail itself was still visible, just barely crushed dirt, winding between pine and oak. But there were no birds, no insects, no wind, just my own footsteps, and the sound of my breath starting to catch, because I felt watched, not from behind, not from above, but from the ground, like something old and buried wanted me to step wrong, to look down and meet its eyes, or its mouth, or maybe its memory. My uncle had written about a place like that. He called it the Bend, the place where the trail forks, but both sides lead to the same ending if you're not careful. And I laughed when I first read it, but now I saw it too, just like in his journal. Two paths, one a little narrower than the other, both going deeper into the forest, and both somehow colder than they should be, like the trees leaned closer over them, blocking out even the grayish light that seeped in from above. And something in me said left, and something else in me said right, but both felt like wrong. Answers I took the left path. And the moment I did, something changed under my feet. The dirt was softer, not like mud, not like decay, but like breathing, like it exhaled when I stepped and inhaled, when I moved away, and I didn't want to believe that I didn't want to think. About lungs in the soil, or something deeper beneath it, but I kept walking because that's what he did, because I had his journal in my pack and I'd marked the same trail, and I knew there were things ahead that would make sense if I just got far enough in then. I heard the knocking, not from the trees, not from behind me, not even from any direction I could name, but it was there, knocking against bone, knocking against wood, knocking, like someone trying to remember how hands work or how doors used to open. And it grew louder, not faster, just louder, like whatever it was got closer each time I blinked. And I didn't want to blink anymore. There were signs along the trail, not the kind you expect, not carved or painted, but stitched into dark bark of trees, little slashes of fabric, little teeth tied into twine, little doll heads facing backward, nailed just above eye level, and they weren't there before. I swear they weren't. I looked up, and they were there after the knocking started. And I didn't scream, I didn't stop, I just kept moving, even though the air felt thicker now, like I was walking through honey or sap or something that didn't want to let me go. My uncle wrote about that too, about how the forest gets heavier the longer you stay, about how your limbs forget they're yours and your heartbeat changes to match something older, something below the roots and above the sky. And I thought he was being poetic or broken or both, but now I wasn't sure because I could feel it too, like my thoughts weren't mine, like my memories weren't lined up right, like I was dreaming someone else's nightmare, and I couldn't wake up. The cabin came into view when I stopped looking for it, like it was waiting for it to forget it existed. Just a little shack sunken into the ground, with moss growing over the roof, and something scrawled on the door that looked like words, but wasn't. And when I touched the handle, it felt warm, not like metal warmed by sun, but like flesh warmed by blood. And I still opened it, because I had to, because he wrote about the cabin too, and what was inside was silence, but not the peaceful kind, the kind that presses against your ears and squeezes out every sound from the inside. And the smell was wrong, not rot, not mold, but something sweet and burnt like sugar boiled too long, or meat cooked in dreams. And I stepped in, and the door didn't close. It just vanished behind me, like the cabin had swallowed it, or like I'd stepped through something else entirely. There was a mirror on the far wall, too tall and too narrow, and something moved behind my reflection. Not a shape, not a shadow, but the idea of movement, like a thought I hadn't thought yet, but still knew was dangerous. And I looked away because the journal said never to stare too long or it'll blink, and then it won't be the mirror anymore. And I believed that more than anything else, the journal was here to not mine, not my uncle's, but another one, worn and stained and trembling on the table, as if the wood breathed too. And when I opened it, the words weren't written. They were carved into the pages like someone used nails or teeth. And the ink wasn't ink, it was too dark, too thick to alive. And the first page said, "Do not leave until you've seen the eyes beneath the hill." And I didn't know what that meant, but I felt something move under the floor, and I didn't want to stay anymore. When I turned around, the cabin had changed. It wasn't a cabin anymore. It was a room in a hospital, or maybe a cave, or maybe a school. I couldn't tell, because it flickered each time I blinked, and each blink took longer to end, and the walls were wrong, too close and too far by, and too wet and too dry. And something was humming, a song that sounded like my mother's voice, but the words were twisted, like they'd been fed through mouths too small to speak and too wide to silence. I ran, then not because I thought I could escape, but because stillness felt worse, because stopping felt like surrender. And the trail outside was gone, replaced by stairs carved into the hill that hadn't been there before. But I knew I had to go up. I knew that's where the eyes were. And I knew they'd been waiting for me. And maybe for my uncle too. And maybe we were both just pieces of the same story, repeating itself like a scream, bouncing between teeth. The stairs hurt not physically, but in the way dreams hurt, in the way memories rot, and each step felt like giving something away, like a name or a face or a part of my voice. And by the time I reached the top, I couldn't remember why. I came here only that I was supposed to, and that someone was watching me from inside the hill, and I knelt down because that's what the journal said to do when the earth starts to breathe and the sky turns black at noon and the roots whisper your Namand. Then the ground split open like a mouth, and I saw the eyes, and they weren't eyes. They were holes filled with memory and light, and something that looked like my uncle smiling. But it wasn't him, it wasn't anyone. It was the shape of guilt and loss and forest and home. And I stepped closer because I didn't want to see anymore, but I couldn't look away, and the voice inside me said, "Welcome back." The voice said, "Welcome back," and I didn't know if it was meant for me or for the thing that followed me, or for the part of my uncle still buried in my shadow, because something had changed when I looked into those eyes, something that didn't unsee when I looked away, something that followed me when I stepped back from the hilltop and felt the trail shift beneath my feet, like it had moved without moving, and I was no longer where I had been. The trees were taller now, or older, or closer, and their bark looked scorched, not burned by fire, but by memory, like they had been forced to remember something too terrible to forget, and they'd clawed their own names off trying to escape it. And there were carvings on the trunks now, not words, not symbols, just patterns of pain spiraling inward like something trying to hide itself in the center of the forest and daring you to follow. I did because I couldn't go back. Not really, not after the eyes, not after the whisper, and not after I saw what was stitched into the base of one of the trees, a patch of fabric soaked in something darker than blood, and a photograph, black and white, with no faces. Just outlines of 5 people, all kneeling in front of a shape that wasn't visible. Not really, but still there, like a hole in the picture. And my uncle's name was written on the back in handwriting that wasn't his. The trail narrowed again, and the silence got heavier, like it had weight, like it was pressing against my chest, like it was trying to slow my steps, and I started to hear something between the trees, not knocking, not humming, but breathing, and it didn't match mine. It was slower, deeper, older, and it followed each step with a breath like it was mirroring me, or maybe feeding on my rhythm, and when I stopped, it stopped too, but a second too late, like it forgot how to hide there. Was a stream that cut across the path, a shallow trickle of water, dark with something thicker than silt and cold enough to sting. And I knelt beside it because something moved under the surface. Not a fish, not a branch, but something pale and blinking, and when I reached for it, my fingers touched. Bone, not human, not animal, just bone, smooth and carved and warm, and I dropped it, but it didn't sink. It floated upstream against the current, like it wanted to return to something waiting above. Water crossed without touching the water again, because the air smelled wrong now, like copper and decay and sweetness, and I could see tracks in the mud beside the stream, not footprints, not hooves, but something like hands dragging backward fingers, digging into the ground like it had pulled itself across the forest again and again, until it learned the way by instinct. The trees opened into a clearing, and there was something standing at the center, a post made of bones, tied with wire and barbed roots, and something nailed to it, a figure, or what used to be a figure, long dried and stitched, together with moss and feathers, burnt, and teeth, and I could see its eyes, still wet, still moving, and it looked at me like it recognized something in me and tilted its head, just enough to make my breath catch behind the post. The earth was broken, a pit filled with ash and hair, and the remnants of something burned, not for warmth, not for light, but for silence. And I saw the edges of the pit move, like they were breathing, like they were listening, and I knew I wasn't alone in the clearing. Not really, not anymore. The voice came back. Not in my head, not in the trees, but in the ground, rising up through the dirt, like steam through cracks in skin. And it said, "Do you see? Now do you see what he gave to stay? Do you see what you must leave behind to understand?" And I didn't want to answer, but something in me already had dropped the now not mine, not his, the other one, the one from the cabin. And the second it hit the ground, the clearing changed. The trees twisted inward. The sky blinked like a shutter, and the pit groaned. And I saw shapes inside it, long and thin and twitching. Not people, not animals, but something in between. And they looked at me with eyes that hadn't closed in years, and mouths stitched into grins wide enough to bleed, ran again, because that's what you do when the story starts repeating itself. And you see your uncle's handwriting carved into the bark ahead, but it's written in blood that's still warm, and the trail loops again, but this time it laughs when you notice, and something touches your shoulder from behind, and your legs stop working right, because the forest has found the part of you that doubts, and it's digging in. There was another cabin, deeper and darker, smaller than the last, but older, like it had been here long before trails existed. And when I stepped inside, I felt my knees give, because there were photographs nailed to every wall, every one of them black and white, every one of them showing someone I knew, but wrong, older, younger, stitched, faced backward, eyes blurred, names scratched out, and one photo still fresh, showing me standing in front of the cabin, staring back with no face at all. The floor was soft underfoot, like moss or skin, or both, and I didn't sit because the chair at the table was already occupied by something that looked like my uncle, or maybe just wore his shape like a coat, and it smiled without teeth, and said, "You're late," and I didn't answer, because I didn't know what time meant here. Not anymore. He reached for me with a hand that dripped like wax, and I stepped back into the doorway and blinked, and he was gone. But the chair still rocked, and the smell still hung in the air, like burnt rope and salt, and I could hear something wet dragging itself across the ceiling above me, not crawling, not walking, just dragging like it had no legs, only hunger. Left the cabin, and the world outside was different again. The sky too low, the trees too tall, and the dirt soft like breath, and there were shapes moving just at the edge of the trail, shapes that ducked when I looked and rose when I turned away, and I knew now that the forest didn't want me lost. It wanted me remembered, wanted me named, wanted me buried in its stories, the way my uncle had been, the way every hiker before me had been, the way every whisper had warned me not to become. The journal in my pack was heavier now, even though I had dropped the other one. and when I opened it, the pages had changed. New entries, written in my own handwriting, telling me things I hadn't done yet, and places I hadn't reached, and memories I didn't want. And the next page said dig, where the pine bends, and I didn't want to, but I knew I would, because that's what the story wanted, because it had already been written now, reached the bent pine hours later, or maybe minutes, or maybe days, because time was strange now, bending like the tree, and I dug with my hands, because nothing else would work, and the dirt peeled away like scabs. Hard, not a box, not a bone, but a mask made of bark and teeth and hair, and when I touched it, I remembered everything, not my life, not his, but the forests, the births and the deaths and the sacrifices, and the names whispered into the soil and forgotten, and the watchers that moved between roots and through dreams, and I saw what he saw, and I screamed without making a sound, because sound had been taken from me long ago, when I stepped past the trailhead and crossed into something older than silence. The mask pulsed in my hand, and I saw the hill again, and the eyes, and the pit, and the thing that had smiled with his face, and I knew. I was being shaped like bark, carved like the photos nailed into walls, and I wasn't me anymore. I was just another page, waiting to be written on another trail, waiting to be walked, another whisper, waiting to be heard. I turned back toward the clearing, because there was nowhere else to go, and the forest leaned in, and the path opened, and the shapes followed. I didn't run this time. I walked because I knew the story didn't end here. It only folded in and in and in. The trail no longer curved, it spiraled downward like the forest was drawing breath, and I was the dust caught in its lungs, and each step sank deeper, not just into the dirt, but into something beneath it, something that remembered names long after. They were forgotten, and I could feel mine slipping from my thoughts, like it had never belonged to me, like I had borrowed it from something older that wanted it back. The pine trees bled as I passed, not sap, not resin, but something black and thick, that steamed in the cold and whispered in a voice I knew too well. And when I looked down, I saw my reflection in the puddles, not the way I looked, but the way I would look, with eyes hollowed out and teeth stitched into a grin wide enough to scream. Through there were symbols carved into the rocks now around the base of the trees, spiral wounds and teeth marks, shaped into language not meant to be spoken out loud. And when I tried to read them, they bled across my vision and painted words into the air that burned when I blinked, and the air itself turned colder, like the forest was watching me again. But this time, it wasn't curious, it was hungry. I saw bones tied into bells hanging from the branches above, and when the wind passed, they didn't ring, they whispered, and each whisper sounded like someone I knew, someone who had died, someone who had died, someone who had disappeared, someone I had forgotten. And the worst voice was mine, calling out from one bell to another in a question I didn't remember, asking. The spiral trail opened into a hollow, and there at the center was a stone altar slick with moss and old blood and dreams, and standing beside it was a figure wrapped in roots and wearing the mask I had dug from the earth, and I knew it wasn't my uncle, not really, but it had his hands, and it held the journal open and pointed to the last page, and I stepped forward because I had no choice anymore. The figure didn't speak, but I heard its voice, and it said, "The forest is memory, and the trail is choice, and the mask is truth, and you have walked too far to go back." And I wanted to run, but my legs had grown heavy, and my heart beat to the rhythm of the knocking and the humming and the breathing, and I could feel the roots curling up around my ankles like fingers made of bark, and sorrow it pointed toward the altar, and I saw the hollow where something should be placed, and I reached into my pack and found not the journal, not food, not water, but a tooth, still warm and still twitching. And I didn't remember putting it there, and when I set it into the hollow, the ground screamed not with sound but with memory, and I saw everything. I saw everything. I saw the first ones who carved the trail, not men, not beasts, but something in between, with faces shaped from bark and eyes full of starlight and hunger, and they danced around the fire with bones tied into their hair, and they spoke a language made from wind and breath and blood, and they gave the forest their names, and it gave them saw the sacrifices over the years, the lost hikers and the chosen ones, the ones who heard the call in their sleep and followed it to the edge of waking, and crossed the trailhead and never returned, except as whispers, except as moss, except as the weight that breathes behind you when you think you're alone. I saw my uncle kneeling beside the altar, tears carving lines down his face as he placed his own name into the hollow, and the forest swallowed it and gave him something else, something that smiled too wide and blinked too slow and never forgot anything. And I saw myself walking the trail before I had ever found the journal, before I had ever been born, walking barefoot with roots wrapped around my legs and the eyes in the hill, watching me grow older and younger and fade into the trees, stumbled back from the altar, and the figure stepped forward and removed the mask, and there was nothing beneath it, only shadow, only memory, only the echo of a name never spoken out loud. And it reached toward me and touched my forehead, and I remembered the first story, the first whisper, the first time I was called by something I couldn't name them. Trees closed in around me, and the bells fell silent, and the ground cracked open. And I fell into the hill, into the eyes, into the place where stories go when they stop being told, and I didn't fall down. I fell inward, and the roots curled around my ribs, and the moss covered my skin, and the trail became part of Maidon. Remember waking up, because I never did. I only opened my eyes to find myself at the trailhead again, standing before the sign that said, Dead Elk Crossing. But now the letters shifted when I blinked and read something different each time, and I saw hikers walking past me, but they didn't see me, not really, not any more. Some walked too far and never came back, and I watched their names fade from their memories, and some turned around just in time and forgot the fear in their bones, but they would hear the whisper again someday and wonder why it felt like home now. I walk the trail, not to escape, not to find him, not to return, but because the forest remembers me, and I remember it, and the journal is still writing new pages, each one with a name, and a date, and a choice, and each one leading back to the hill with the eyes, and the altar with the tooth, and the whisper that says, welcome back. I never should have taken that left turn at the faded marker near Bear Skull Creek. The trail wasn't even on my map, and the sign was nearly buried in moss, but something about the name, Devil's Backbone Ridge, pulled me like a rope around my ribs. I had been hiking the Rockies for years, chasing isolation and silence, the kind of quiet you only get when you're miles from anything that breathes gasoline. This trail, though it felt different. The pines leaned in too close, and their bark looked like it had been flayed away in narrow strips, revealing pale wood like exposed bone. And there was that smell, not rot exactly, not pine either. It was wet iron and something older, something that shouldn't have been breathing. I adjusted my pack and stepped over a sun-bleached antler that looked too large for any elk. The ground was soft, as if the forest floor had been churned up by something beneath it. There were no birds, not even the high whine of flies. The only sound was the crunch of my boots and something else trailing it a half-step behind, too quiet to place, too rhythmic to be winded. Hour in, and I'd passed a collapsed ranger cabin choked in ivy. Its windows were punched out, and the door had been clawed, not kicked. The wood peeled in deep furrows inside. I found old maps, all shredded like confetti, and a wall covered in photos, all hikers, every one of them facing the camera, eyes wide, shoulders stiff. Some were in black and white, some in color, some had names scratched beneath them, and others just numbers. I found one photo that hadn't rotted. It looked fresh, and it was me, same pack, same clothes, same expression. Except I hadn't taken that picture. My breath got caught in my throat like a fishhook, and I backed out of that cabin and nearly tripped over the same antler I'd seen earlier, even though I hadn't turned back. The ridge began to climb, and the mist got thicker, like the air had turned to milk. Pines arched overhead like ribs in a whale skeleton. And the farther I walked, the more I heard it whispering, not from ahead, not from behind, but in my left ear. It said my name slow and gurgled like someone was trying to say it underwater. And then came the screams. They didn't echo, they didn't fade. They were right next to me, men, women, children, all screaming from inside the trees. Not from behind them, from inside them. The bark split in thin black mouths along the trunks, and they writhed with voices. Hundreds of them begging, pleading, some laughing. I ran. But the trail didn't change. The turns looped back on themselves, and the trees bent even closer. Like fingers, I found another cabin. This one intact but wrong. It had no doors, only windows, and inside were shelves of preserved eyes. In jars, some blinked when I looked at them. My compass spun like a drunk, and my GPS just glitched static and symbols. I tried to climb the ridge, thinking maybe the height would clear the fog. Instead, it got thicker, and I started seeing things in the mist, tall shapes, moving too smooth to be human. One walked directly toward me, without breaking eye contact. Its skin was bark, its limbs too long, and where its face should be been was a stretched, smooth patch of flesh, and yet I could feel it, looking at MIT, pointed behind me. I turned nothing. When I turned back, it was gone. But there was a hole in the dirt where it had stood, and the edges were pulsing. I heard humming then, not like a tune, more like a throat trying to mimic one eye. Followed it, because I had no choice. the trail opened into a clearing with stones set in a circle and a wooden post in the center. On the post hung a fresh deer carcass, upside down, split open from throat to belly, but it wasn't bleeding. Instead, black feathers spilled out, thousands of them, and from within them came a noise like babies crying. I turned away and saw names carved into the stones. Every one of them matched the photos from the cabin at the bottom of the last stone was mine. Carved sloppily, as if in a rush, something whispered in my right ear. This time, it said, "Dig." So I did. I clawed at the dirt with my hands until my nails split and my skin tore, and then I found it. A box inside was a recorder and a note. The note read, "Play this before the sun goes down, or it will begin again." The recorder clicked on by itself, and the voice that came out was mine. Not just mine. It was me describing everything I had just experienced, word for word. Then the recording continued past, that it began to describe things that hadn't happened yet. Me walking to the edge of the clearing, me finding a trail marked with broken antlers, me stepping onto it because I had no other choice, and I did because I couldn't stop myself. New trail sloped downward, and the air got warmer, like stepping into the mouth of something sleeping. The trees began to change, no longer pine. These had white trunks like bones, and their branches swayed. Without wind, the whispers turned to groans low, by and heavy like something dying slowly, came to a bridge of rusted metal, spanning a black creek, and nailed to its railing was a single sign: "Welcome to Devil's Backbone. No return beyond this point." I crossed it, and the screaming began again, louder this time, and I knew the trees were getting hungry again. My boots stuck to the bridge, as if something beneath the rusted metal wanted to hold on just a second longer. Each step made a sound like wet breath, and when I reached the other side, the trees leaned in so close they touched my shoulders. I tried to turn back. The bridge was gone, not crumbled, just not there anymore, as if it had been erased from the world behind me. There was no sky above me anymore, only a ceiling of black pine needles, woven so thick they blotted out the light, and yet I could still see everything glowed faintly with a color that had no name. The trunks of the trees pulsed slowly like they were breathing. The earth beneath me felt hollow, and every now and then it shivered like something massive was turning in its sleep. Just below the surface I followed the trail because there was nothing else I could do. Something had taken choice from me. That something was patient, and it liked to watch me realize it was already too late. The deeper I walked, the more unnatural. Everything became birds that had no wings, but fluttered through the air by twisting their bodies in spirals. Rabbits with empty sockets where their eyes should be, and teeth that never stopped clicking. I passed a tree that had hundreds of human teeth embedded into its bark, each one chattering like wind-up toys. I heard crying ahead, soft at first, a girl's voice. It sounded like she was just past the bend. When I turned the corner, I saw her, a little girl, no older than 7, sitting on a pile of bones and holding a doll with no face. Her dress was stained in something dark, and she was humming the same tune I had heard in the mist. She looked up at me and smiled, but her mouth didn't move. Instead, the bark on the trees behind her peeled open and whispered hello in dozens of overlapping voices that tried to sound like mine. She stood up and pointed toward a narrow path to the right. The doll in her hand raised its own arm in sync. Then she vanished in a blink. No sound, no wind, just gone. I didn't want to follow the path, but my legs began walking on their own, like I had become a puppet. The path narrowed to the width of my shoulders, and black vines slithered across my arms like veins, trying to dig into my skin. I started hearing music, a violin playing notes that made no sense. Together, it felt like my teeth were being pulled with every note. High, low, wrong, wrong, wrong. The trail ended at a house. It was built entirely of antlers. They jutted out in every direction, and the door was just a hole in the center, shaped like an open mouth. I stepped inside, and it closed behind me. Inside was a spiral staircase that went down forever. The walls were covered in stretched parchment, covered in writing that pulsed and shifted every time I tried to read it. The steps were made of bone, and the farther I descended, the louder the violin got, until it was behind my ears. Inside my skull, like my brain was humming with it. At the bottom of the stairs was a room lit by floating candles that never flickered. In the center was a man sitting in a chair made of fingers. He was blindfolded, his mouth was sewn shut, and he held a violin carved from a human spine. He tilted his head as if sensing me, then he played a single note, and suddenly I remembered everything I had forgotten. I remembered being here before. I remembered carving my name into that stone in the clearing. I remembered walking into the woods on a dare 15 years ago with 2 friends who never made it out. I remembered the pact we made near the fire, to stay until we found the truth. I remembered breaking it. The man in the chair stood, and his blindfold fell away, revealing empty sockets that dripped something black and thick. He pointed behind me, and I turned to see mirrors lining the walls. Each one showed me at different ages, running, screaming, begging to leave in. One of them I watched myself climb the ridge, in another I saw myself dying beneath it, and in the last I saw nothing, just trees and the sound of whispering laughter. The man began to play again, and the mirrors shattered at the same time. My ears began to bleed. I fell to my knees. The music peeled the thoughts from my skull one by one, until only silence was left. Then I heard her again, the little girl's voice, only now it was coming from inside me. She said, "You've been here long enough. It's time to choose." She gave me 2 options: stay and forget again, or leave and bring someone back in my place. I asked who she was, and she said, "I am the scream in the trees. I am the deal made in dying breath. I am the thing that waits where paths should end." She opened a door behind me, and I saw the trail again, lit by that strange light, but I wasn't holding my pack anymore. I was holding the camera from the ranger cabin. I stepped outside, and the forest was still, but I knew it was only stipend. I knew I had already chosen, because I heard footsteps behind me, and they matched my own, and I hadn't taken a single step. I didn't turn round. I couldn't, because every bone in my body whispered the same thing. If you look at it, you stay forever. So I walked step after slow step down a path that hadn't been there before. The forest around me held its breath. No wind, no sound, just waiting. The camera in my hands was warm, like it had just been pulled from inside something alive. Its lens pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I didn't remember turning it on, but it was recording. I could see myself on the tiny screen, even though there was no light. I was smiling, but I wasn't moving my face. Trail shifted again and led me past old campsites overgrown with vines that bled. Each tent was flattened, and inside them were the outlines of people burned into the ground, charred silhouettes curled in fetal positions, or crawling toward the exits that were always just out of reach. I passed a tree with a jacket pinned to it. My jacket, the one I'd lost years ago on a different trip. Halfway across the state I checked the tag. It had my blood type written in something. Sticky voices rose up again. This time they weren't whispers, they were mine. From every moment I had ever lied to myself, I heard them all at once. I'm fine, it's not real, I can make it out. They laughed at the end, like they knew the truth, like they had been waiting for me to admit. It reached a crossroads marked with bones. One path led uphill to a ridge glowing red like molten stone. The other sank downward into a tunnel, put of roots that moved slightly like breathing lungs. The camera tugged in my hands like it wanted to go left. But the footsteps behind me moved right. Ran, left the trees, screamed not like people, like something older than sound, like time itself was. Trying to peel open the ridge, climbed fast and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop because I could feel it behind me, not chasing, escalating. When I reached the top, the mist broke, and for the first time in hours, maybe days, I saw sky, but it wasn't the one I remembered. It was gray and streaked with black veins, and the sun was a hole, not a light. And all across the sky were things floating just above the clouds, not birds, not stars. Shapes too big to be seen, all at once. Turned to look behind me, and this time I couldn't stop myself. There was nothing there, no path, no trees. Just a drop into endless forest that spiraled down like a whirlpool made of bark and screams. And at the edge was the girl standing on air, holding the faceless doll, which now looked exactly like mesh. Said this is where stories end or begin, depending on who tells it. She pointed down, and I saw bodies climbing the trees, not hanging, climbing face first, like spiders in reverse. And they all had my face, every one of them. I screamed or tried to, but no sound came out. She smiled, and the sky split open just a little, enough to show teeth behind the clouds. Then I was falling, not through air, through memories. I saw myself camping near Devil's Backbone 2 years ago, and hearing someone scream in the distance. I saw myself walk away from the fire with my flashlight shaking. I saw myself meet someone that looked exactly like me, standing on the trail ahead, and waving. My never made it back to camp. That version of me did, and he'd been living my life ever since I landed hard on pine needles and sat up. I was back at the trailhead. The sign was clean now. Fresh paint, Devil's Backbone Ridge. Scenic route open to publica. Ranger stood nearby and asked if I was okay. I nodded. He didn't ask for my name. He just smiled and said we're always happy when someone makes it out. Then he whispered into his radio, too quiet for me to hear. When I walked to my car, it was already running and the back seat was full of dirt. I checked my phone and I had photos. Photos I didn't take, photos of me smiling next to people I didn't know on trails. I'd never hiked. One of them was standing behind Maine. The reflection of the rearview mirror. When I turned, there was nothing but I smelled pine, and I heard a scream echoing faintly from the trees. Scream that matched my own, and when I checked the time stamp, it hadn't happened yet, but it would, because the forest doesn't forget, and neither do the things that live in it. And now that I'm out, I understand the rule: you leave the trail. But it doesn't leave you, it follows, it waits, it wears your skin, till someone else steps onto the path, till someone else makes the wrong turn, till someone else hears the scream that sounds just like their own voice, calling them home.